to persistently be subject to injustice and unfairness can try even the strongest faith. And every heart, it seems, has its breaking point. Our minds tell us that ultimately all accounts will be settled in accordance with God's justice. But there will be a time in every human heart where our heart wants to give up and stop listening. We will see in the pages of Genesis that those who have gone before us have been in that place many times. We will see Noah come to that place, and we will learn that God remembered Noah. We will see Abraham get to that place, and we will learn that God remembered Abraham. We will see Rachel get to that place and see that God remembered Rachel. And then we will see Joseph, Rachel's son, sold into slavery, thrown into prison, and subject to injustice after injustice. And he will interpret the dream of Pharaoh's chief butler and ask Pharaoh's chief butler, please remember me when you are restored. And then the storyteller drops the hammer. The butler did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. It leaves it to us to ask the question, will God remember Joseph? Will God remember me? Like the master storyteller at summer camp, the book of Genesis invites us to see ourselves in its stories and challenges us to compare our perspective to God's. Welcome to And God Remembered, Genesis as Story. Hey folks, thank you for joining me in this second installment of my podcast in God Remembered, Genesis as Story. I hope my quick overview of Genesis helps set the stage for understanding an overarching theme in its stories. My hope here is to draw you in to the sweeping narrative of God's redemption of the heavens and the earth. Now, among evangelical Christians, there are a set of assumptions about Genesis. We seem mainly concerned about how the ideas of evolution, for example, competes with the biblical story. Well, to cut to the chase, I'm not going to worry about that. Personally, I think it is a distraction. The creation story in Genesis is not the script for God's YouTube channel. It's not a reporter's notebook of a blow-by-blow account of what she saw. It is, plainly and simply, a story. Now, as a Christian, I believe in this idea we call inspiration. It means we believe the storytelling was uniquely guided by God. The question, however, is why? Why did God guide this storytelling? Did he guide the storytelling so we could settle our modern arguments over origins? I think the answer is no. I think he inspired the telling of the story for three things. And the first thing I think it was to do is to set the stage for the drama of redemption. In my next podcast, we'll actually start digging in to Genesis 1. And because we're preconditioned to think in terms of, was a day an actual 24-hour, was the 7 days of creation actual 24 hours, 7 days, as we experience it in the calendar. I frankly think that has very little, if anything, to do with why the story is told the way it is. Because we'll see when the story presents to us the very, very first sentence. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then the story goes and describes the heavens and the earth. And it describes it in language that helps us. The language is, I'm going to use a big $10 seminary word, forgive me. It's phenomenological. The language is not used to describe how it really is. Because if it were, then when we use the word sunrise, well, we know the sun doesn't rise. We use the word moonlight. We know the moon doesn't have its own light. This is an example of phenomenological language. And so the story calls it the greater light and the lesser light. The moon is called the lesser light, as if it has its own light. Well, we all know the moon doesn't have its own light. So how do we resolve these things? How do we reconcile ourselves? Well, we recognize that the language that's being used here is not meant to describe exactly things as they are. It's meant to describe the way things appear and the way things function from the standpoint of humanity, from our standpoint. If we can just imagine that we don't know all of the things about the cosmos that we know, and that we're an ancient person. The story in Genesis uses language to describe creation from the perspective of the reader. And we're going to get into this question of perspective quite often. So it starts out by saying, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That right there, you have it. The stage is set. That is the stage for the drama of God's redemption. And then the second reason is to introduce us to ourselves, to our place in the world around us, into our relationship with God as our creator. That's the second reason why the story, I believe, was inspired to be told the way it is. And then the third is to invite us to see ourselves and our perspective as characters in the story, so we can compare our perspective to God's perspective. And I will come back to this over and over and over again. I'll give you a little preview for the next podcast. If you can imagine standing at the beach with the waves lapping up against your feet, then you can understand that there are waters below, as we will read in Genesis 1. And now, if you can imagine you're standing at the beach with waters lapping up against your feet and it's raining, and you put your palms out and you watch as the rain pools in your palms, and then you look down at your feet and you look at your palms and you see that's the same thing. There's waters below and there's waters above. And it is told, the story is told in such a way that entertains our perspective. And it was told to entertain the perspective of people who had not learned about the water cycle in grade school, like we did. All they had was the water lapping up against the feet and the water falling from the sky. So there had to be waters below and waters above. So those three things, and I want to go over those three things one more time. So we just set the stage for what we're going to do. We set the stage for the drama of redemption. That's the first thing that the stories of Genesis are going to do. The very first verse does it all by itself. Just one sentence. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And now the stage is set. We're going to introduce ourselves. We're going to introduce ourselves to ourselves. The story introduces us to ourselves. It introduces, and this is in the couple of Adam and Eve. And I'll tackle this whole question as to whether they're real, actual people or not. We'll get to that. But the point is the characters in the story, especially the characters of Adam and Eve, they are formed as part of the story to introduce us to ourselves and to our place in the world around us and to our relationship with our Creator. And then to invite us to see ourselves and our perspective as characters in the story so that we can then compare our perspective to God's. That's where we're going to go with this podcast. And thank you again for joining me. I'm going to try to keep each one, as simple as possible and keep it down to hopefully about 15 minutes each. And I think what I'm also going to do, look for podcasts that I call technical backgrounds. I'm working on a script for the technical background on the Jacob story, Genesis 32. Kind of, if you're interested in like biblical Hebrew and kind of understanding the technical background to why I'm reading it, the way I'm reading it, I'm going to do a separate podcast for each chapter that will go into that technical background. I don't want that to get in the way of the story. The story isn't about biblical Hebrew. The story is about you and me. It's about introducing us to ourselves, introducing us to our place in the world, and introducing us to the God who created us. So God bless you. Thank you very much for joining me. And see you next time with And God Remembered, Genesis, a story.